July 17th, 1944, Port Chicago, California. At a small naval ammunition base east of San Francisco, young black sailors worked through the night, loading bombs and shells onto ships bound for the Pacific. Most of them had never been trained for such dangerous work, yet white officers ordered them to move faster, ignoring every safety rule. At 10:18 p.m., the sky turned white. A massive explosion ripped through the docks, shattering glass 50 miles away. 320 men were killed, almost all of them black. But what followed would be even more shocking than the blast itself. It was 1944. The Second World War was at its peak. Across Europe and the Pacific, Allied forces were locked in brutal battles against Germany and Japan. America's factories were running day and night, producing ships, planes, and ammunition. But behind this massive war machine lay a silent racial divide. While white officers and sailors commanded from safe positions, thousands of African American servicemen were assigned to menial or dangerous jobs, often without proper training or safety. In the Navy, segregation was official policy. Black sailors could serve only as cooks, stewards, or laborers. Port Chicago, a small naval ammunition depot near San Francisco Bay, became one such place where this injustice was routine. Hundreds of young black sailors, most in their late teens or early 20s, were ordered to handle live explosives at a pace designed for disaster. They didn't know it yet, but this assignment would lead to one of the deadliest home front tragedies of the war and a turning point in the fight for racial equality in the U.S. military. In 1944, America stood as the arsenal of democracy, fighting fascism abroad while practicing segregation at home. Jim Crow laws still divided buses, schools, and even blood supplies. The irony was painful. Black men were expected to risk their lives for a freedom they themselves didn't fully have. Within the U.S. military, racial inequality was not just social, it was structural. The Army had segregated units, and the Navy was even worse. African Americans were excluded from combat and officer ranks. The Navy's upper command claimed black sailors lacked technical ability, assigning them instead to cooking, cleaning, and cargo work. At the Port Chicago Naval Magazine near Concord, California, these policies took on a deadly form. White officers gave orders. Black enlisted men loaded live bombs and shells, without safety training, without mechanical equipment, and under relentless pressure to set new records. Officers even turned it into a competition between divisions, offering rewards for faster loading. It was a racially charged system that valued speed over safety, human lives measured in tons of ammunition per hour. This wasn't just a work assignment. It was a ticking time bomb, powered by discrimination, ignorance, and arrogance. The sailors of Port Chicago were young, hopeful, and proud to wear the uniform of the United States Navy. Most came from poor black communities across the South and Midwest, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Illinois. Many had never seen the ocean before. They joined to serve their country, to prove themselves equal, and to escape the racial violence of civilian life. Among them was Joseph Small, known to his friends as Joe, a 22-year-old from New Jersey. Joe was smart, outspoken, and quietly determined. He noticed the absurdity of it all. White officers shouting orders from safe distances while black men handled high explosives with no instruction. "We didn't even know how to load ammunition properly," he would later recall. Every day, hundreds of black sailors worked under glaring floodlights, sweating through double shifts. They loaded bombs weighing hundreds of pounds into cargo ships bound for the Pacific. Each clang of metal, each spark from a chain or crate carried the risk of instant death. Yet amid this pressure, there was pride and brotherhood. They laughed, sang, and tried to believe they were contributing to victory. None of them imagined that within weeks their base would vanish in a single, blinding explosion, and their names would become a footnote in America's hidden history of wartime racism. By mid-July 1944, the pace at Port Chicago had become unbearable. Ammunition ships were leaving for the Pacific almost daily, and the demand for faster loading grew harsher with every order from above. White officers, most of them with little technical knowledge, turned the docks into a contest. One division was ordered to outload the other. Whoever broke the tonnage record would earn a weekend pass. Black sailors protested quietly. Some spoke of the shaking decks and sparks from metal chains. Others feared the unstable bombs stacked high under the California sun. But every concern was dismissed as laziness or cowardice. The Navy's segregation policy left them no voice, no authority to question orders, no right to refuse. On the night of July 17, 1944, two ships, the E.A. Bryan and the Quinault Victory, were docked side by side, loaded with over 4,600 tons of high explosives. Sailors worked overtime to meet quotas. Grates slammed, engines roared, orders echoed. Then at exactly 10:18 p.m., a flash tore through the pier. The sound was heard 50 miles away. In a single instant, 320 men were gone, vaporized in the largest July 17, 1944, Port Chicago, California. Night had fallen, and the base was alive with noise. Cargo cranes screeched, trucks rattled, and the docks glowed under blinding floodlights. Two ships, E.A. Bryan and Quinault Victory, were almost full. Each carried thousands of tons of bombs and shells, bound for the Pacific War. In the sweltering night, black sailors worked under pressure that felt more military than mechanical. White officers barked orders to move faster, timing the men with stopwatches. Some sailors joked nervously, trying to mask their fear. Others whispered warnings about the shaking decks and the reckless pace. None of them had ever received proper safety training. They were told explosives wouldn't go off easily. They believed it because believing otherwise meant admitting they were working on a floating death trap. Then came a blinding flash. Witnesses later described a blue-white light ripping through the pier, brighter than the sun. The ground heaved. A second explosion followed, even larger, as E.A. Bryan vanished in a column of fire and steel. Windows shattered 20 miles away. The sky turned red. In less than a second, 320 men were killed. Sailors, civilians, officers. The dock was gone. The town of Port Chicago was reduced to splinters, and America's worst naval disaster on home soil had begun. Home front disaster of World War II. When the explosion hit, the night itself seemed to split apart. The E.A. Bryan was gone, vaporized. The Quinault Victory had been ripped open like paper. Pieces of steel rained down for miles. A 12-ton locomotive was hurled into the air like a toy. For a few heartbeats, there was silence. Then came the screams. At the nearby barracks, hundreds of sailors were thrown from their bunks. Some thought Japan had launched an attack. Others ran barefoot across the shattered base, searching for their friends, their brothers. But what they found was unimaginable. The pier was gone. The water boiled with burning oil. Body parts floated in the bay, mixed with twisted metal and smoking wood. Of the 23 men working that night, not a single black loading crew survived. Those who had been off duty stumbled through the chaos, calling names into the smoke. "Small, Brooks!" "Turner?" No answer. One survivor later recalled finding only a fragment of a shoe still smoldering. Another picked up a torn piece of uniform. The name tag melted away. Firefighters worked through the night, but the inferno was unstoppable. The next morning, the site looked like a crater from another planet. Reporters were kept out. The Navy sealed off the area, ordering silence. In nearby towns, black families waited for news that never came. Telegrams began to arrive. Missing, presumed dead, killed in service. For many mothers and wives, the letters arrived without explanation, without apology. The surviving sailors were transferred to another base, still trembling from the trauma. They weren't offered counseling. They weren't given rest. Instead, within days, they were ordered back to work, to load more ammunition under the same officers, on the same unsafe docks. Their hearts sank. The smell of burned metal still clung to their clothes. The sound of the blast still echoed in their minds. Yet when some hesitated, they were told, "You're in the Navy now. You do as you're told. For many, fear turned into quiet rage. They had seen their friends vaporized by negligence. And now, the system that killed them was pretending nothing had happened. Something inside them began to shift. The obedience that once came with their uniforms began to crumble, replaced by a dangerous thought. If our lives don't matter to them, then we must take a stand ourselves. The orders came just days after the explosion. The surviving men, still traumatized, still haunted by what they'd seen, were gathered on the deck. A white officer read from a clipboard, "You will return to ammunition loading duty immediately." A murmur spread through the ranks. Eyes met, no one moved. They remembered the fire, the screams, the silence. They remembered the smell of flesh and gunpowder. And they remembered the officers, the same ones who had pushed for speed records that killed their friends. For the men of Port Chicago, this was not disobedience. It was self-preservation. One sailor, Joseph Small, a young man from North Carolina, spoke quietly, "Sir, we're not refusing to work. We just don't want to die." But to the Navy's white command, fear was insubordination. Within hours, guards surrounded the barracks. The men were threatened with court-martial if they didn't return to work. Some gave in, but 50 stood firm. These 50 sailors were arrested, charged with mutiny, and marched away in handcuffs. The trial was held at the Mare Island Naval Base. It was the largest mass mutiny trial in U.S. Navy history. The courtroom was stifling, filled with white officers, reporters, and a few quiet observers from the NAACP, including a young lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. The prosecution painted the men as rebels, a threat to wartime discipline. The defense argued they were victims of racism and fear, not mutineers. But the judges had already decided. The men's courage, their trauma, their humanity, none of it mattered in that courtroom. Each sailor stood as his name was called, and each heard the same verdict, guilty. Their punishment, up to 15 years of hard labor. When the sentences were read, Joseph Small didn't bow his head. He turned to his lawyer and whispered, "If standing up for our lives is mutiny, then maybe it's time they learned what real mutiny looks like." The Navy silenced them, but the story refused to die. The explosion that took 320 lives had exposed something deeper, a truth that America could no longer bury under the ashes of Port Chicago. In the weeks that followed the trial, Port Chicago faded from the headlines. The Navy quietly rebuilt the docks, replaced the ships, and reassigned officers. But for the black sailors who survived, and for the families who lost everything, there was no rebuilding, only grief and disbelief. At funerals, caskets arrived sealed shut. The remains were unrecognizable, mixed fragments of many men. Some families received coffins filled only with sand. Mothers were told not to ask questions. Widows were told to be proud that their husbands died serving their country. The surviving 50 were sent to prison labor camps, their records stained forever. When they wrote letters home, many were censored. Others simply vanished. At the base, white officers carried on as if nothing had happened. Promotions continued. Commendations were issued for maintaining order. The message was clear. Loyalty mattered more than lives, but not everyone accepted that silence. Across the country, whispers spread through the black press. Was it mutiny or murder? The U.S. Navy had one priority: control the narrative. An official investigation was conducted, but behind closed doors. It concluded that the explosion was caused by improper handling of munitions by the enlisted men themselves. The blame, once again, was placed on the dead. No white officer was disciplined. No safety policies were changed. The Navy's official report didn't even mention segregation or lack of training. But outside the walls of the Pentagon, something was stirring. Thurgood Marshall, representing the NAACP, launched a public campaign. He toured military bases, gave interviews, and declared, "The Navy is trying to cover up a disaster of its own making. These men are not mutineers, they are martyrs of injustice." Marshall's words echoed across black newspapers and churches nationwide. Still, the federal government stood firm. The War Department refused to reopen the case. President Roosevelt never issued a statement. The 50 men became political ghosts, erased from military honor, forgotten by history, imprisoned for defying death itself. As World War II ended, America celebrated victory and unity. But the story of Port Chicago didn't fit that image. It was buried, literally and historically. For decades, the explosion was barely mentioned in textbooks or naval museums. Families who asked for records were told they didn't exist. Journalists were discouraged from digging too deep. Meanwhile, the Navy used the rebuilt Port Chicago to train new sailors, almost all of them still black. Still segregated, still loading bombs, yet the silence couldn't last forever. In the 1950s and 60s, as the civil rights movement gained strength, old wounds began to reopen. Activists, historians, and survivors started asking the same question: why were the only men punished at Port Chicago, the ones who survived? The Navy's image of discipline had come at the cost of justice, and the ghosts of 320 men, vaporized on that July night, still waited for America to say their names. Days after the explosion, the ruins of Port Chicago still smoked. Bodies were pulled from the water, twisted metal scattered across miles. The survivors were in shock, ears ringing, eyes hollow. Many couldn't sleep. Every sound reminded them of the blast, but before they could even grieve, the Navy issued new orders. Report back to work. Resume loading ammunition. The men froze. They looked at one another, horrified. They had just watched hundreds of friends die doing that exact job. They refused. Out of nearly 400 black sailors, 258 initially said no. They weren't protesting the war. They weren't disobeying out of laziness. They simply wanted training, safety, and dignity. But the Navy saw only color and command. The officers called it mutiny, one of the gravest crimes in military law. For weeks, the press stayed silent. The Navy tried to hide the story. Then came the Port Chicago mutiny trials at Treasure Island, San Francisco. The courtroom was all white. The accused, 50 black sailors, sat quietly as lawyers argued that Negroes were naturally afraid of explosions. Among those 50 was Joe Small, a soft-spoken man who had survived the blast. He spoke for all of them when he said, "We're not refusing duty, we're refusing to die like fools." The verdict was swift. All 50 men were found guilty of mutiny and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. But the shockwaves of that decision reached far beyond California. The black press erupted. The Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, and Baltimore Afro-American all demanded justice. Civil rights leaders called it America's shame. Even Eleanor Roosevelt privately questioned the fairness of the trial. The case forced the nation to confront an ugly truth. African Americans were dying for a freedom they still didn't have. By 1946, mounting pressure led the Navy to quietly release the sailors. None received a formal apology, yet the Port Chicago 50 had already changed history. Their defiance planted the seed for something bigger, the desegregation of the U.S. Navy, which officially began in 1946 and spread through all branches by 1948. The Navy tried to erase their names, but history didn't forget. Because in refusing to load those bombs, those men had done something braver than anyone realized. They had challenged a system more explosive than gunpowder itself: racism. When the trial ended, the Port Chicago 50 were sent to military prisons across the country. Their uniforms were stripped away, but not their dignity. Each man carried the memory of that explosion, the flash, the screams, the injustice outside the prison walls. The world began to notice. Black newspapers called it the Navy's shame. Editorials demanded answers. How can America fight Hitler's racism abroad while practicing its own at home? Among those who took up their cause was Thurgood Marshall, a young lawyer from the NAACP, the same man who would later become the first black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Marshall personally investigated the case, attended the trial, and declared, "This is not mutiny, this is murder by the Navy." His outcry caught Washington's attention. Under political pressure, the Navy reviewed its segregation policies. For the first time, senior officers began to admit that racial division weakened the military's efficiency. In 1946, the Navy formally ended segregation in its ranks. 2 years before President Harry Truman ordered full desegregation across all U.S. armed forces. The Port Chicago 50 had unknowingly become civil rights pioneers in uniform, but recognition came painfully slow. For decades, the U.S. government stayed silent. The men were never reinstated, and their convictions remained on record. Families of those killed received only token compensation, not justice. It wasn't until the 1980s that the story began to re-emerge. Historians and journalists, many African American, started digging through Navy archives. Survivors finally spoke publicly about what they had seen. The truth could no longer be buried under patriotic slogans. In 1994, 50 years after the explosion, the U.S. Congress established the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial near the site of the blast, honoring the 320 men who died and the 50 who dared to question why. In 1999, President Bill Clinton pardoned one of the convicted sailors, Freddie Meeks, acknowledging the injustice, though the rest still wait for full exoneration. Today, the Port Chicago story is taught in classrooms and commemorated every July 17th. It stands as a haunting reminder of 2 wars fought at once, one against fascism overseas and another against racism at home. A survivor once said, "We didn't have medals or monuments, but we had truth. And truth lasts longer than steel. And that truth, the courage to say no when obedience means death, is why Port Chicago still matters. Because history isn't just about battles won, it's also about the men who refused to fight under the wrong flag. The flag of injustice. Nearly 8 decades have passed since that night in Port Chicago, yet the echo of that explosion still rolls across America's conscience. Every July, when the winds sweep over Suisun Bay, they carry more than the sound of ships and seagulls. They carry the memory of 320 men, most of them young, poor and black, men who believed they were serving freedom only to be betrayed by it. The Port Chicago disaster isn't just a military accident. It's a mirror, reflecting how racism can corrode even the noblest of causes. While the U.S. Navy fought tyranny in Europe and the Pacific, it allowed injustice to flourish in its own ranks. But from that tragedy rose an unexpected victory, a spark that lit the way toward equality in the armed forces, and later the civil rights movement. Before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, before Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of justice, 50 sailors had already said no. Their stand wasn't on a bus or a bridge. It was on a burning pier, against orders, against fear, and against the system itself. Today, historians call them mutineers, but truth gives them another name, heroes, because courage isn't always about pulling a trigger. Sometimes it's about refusing to, when doing so keeps others safe. As the sun sets over the quiet waters of Port Chicago, a simple plaque marks the site. No grand parade, no military band, just names carved in stone, whispered by the wind. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the voices of the men who dared to ask why. In a time when silence was safer, their story reminds us that justice delayed is never justice denied, not when memory keeps it alive. They died loading the bombs that won the war, but they also lit the fuse that changed America.